Great. So if you're familiar with our research, as I mentioned, we've been tracking some of these questions for a long time. And I just wanted to highlight some of the figures that have changed this past year, some of the trends that we're seeing move in positive directions, and kind of walk you through the data. At the end of the webinar, we will be sharing our executive findings memo that has additional details around all of these findings, so you can reference them as well on your own after this. So first we're going to start with kind of how is the UN's favorability doing in the United States. And in fact, we found that 2/3 of voters have a favorable image of the United Nations. It's important to note, as you can see in the chart, this is the highest favorability rating of the UN since our tracking started. As you can see, it's right higher than before the pre-Iraq War era. Looking at the subgroups where the favorability shifted most, we saw that retired voters, stay-at-home moms, women ages 35 through 54, women with college degrees, suburban women were all the highest shift in people who now have a more favorable opinion of the United Nations. As we have seen in years of tracking, partisanship does impact voters' perceptions of the United Nations at times. In this case, in this poll, we found that Democrats had a very favorable impression of the UN at 87% favorable and only 7% unfavorable. Majorities of independents have a favorable view of the UN at 67% favorable and 21% unfavorable. And then a slight plurality of Republicans had a favorable image at 47% favorable and 43% unfavorable. So that is really where you see a little bit of the partisan divide. We then asked voters whether they believed it was very important or somewhat important for the U.S. to maintain an active role in the UN. And we found that 60% of Americans said it was very important for the U.S. to do so. And that was true across party lines, strong majorities of Republicans, independents, and Democrats. Republicans at 69% favorable, independents at 84%, and Democrats at 96% believe it is very or somewhat important for the U.S. to maintain an active role in the United Nations. Now, as we can see on this slide here, we also compared the UN's favorability with some other institutions. And as you can see, the UN actually performed the highest favorable rating among other organizations, including NATO, Congress, UNICEF, and President Trump. Moreover, particularly relevant to our work here at UNA USA, I would say, we asked a question about funding. So as you can see in this chart, more than 7 in 10 voters support the U.S. paying our dues to the UN on time and in full. This is the highest level of support and the lowest level of opposition since our tracking began on this question in 2010. So currently 72% favor this and 25% opposed. I should flag that this is also true across party lines. So majorities of both Democrats, Republicans, and independents support paying our dues to the UN. Republicans favor paying our dues at 55%. Independents favor paying our dues at 78%. And Democrats favor paying our dues to the UN at 84%. Now, when it comes to our dues to UN peacekeeping, the numbers shift a little bit. 67% favor paying our dues to UN peacekeeping and 28% oppose. We did see that majorities of Democrats and independents paying both our UN general dues and peacekeeping dues on time and in full. And majorities of Republicans support the U.S. paying our UN dues on time and in full. But more split on paying our peacekeeping dues. So that is a bit of a shift in terms of party lines. All right, we can go to the next slide. So this was a new question we asked this time around, and it was really to get at the idea that what should the U.S. do when we are, if we're not achieving all of our objectives with other countries at the UN. And in fact, we found that a majority of voters, at 59%, said that the U.S. should try to find a new diplomatic strategies and new allies at the UN to achieve our objectives. Only 22% of voters said the U.S. should leave the negotiating table and try to achieve its objectives without working through the UN. And we saw that 2 in 10 voters didn't have a strong say either way. There were some differences on this question across party lines. Independents favored a new diplomatic strategy by 60%. Democrats favored a new diplomatic strategy at 76%. And then Republicans were more split between a new diplomatic strategy and leaving the negotiating table at 41-42. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marco to continue through the presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for going through that very in-depth research. It's very important for us to know as a grassroots advocacy organization what this information means for us and how we can effectively communicate our mission to fully fund the United Nations and to advocate on behalf of the UN and our communities. I do, before we get into questions on more on this research and on the poll itself, I do want to just empower all of you, as I always strive to do, by creating a call to action, given this really stark information about America for the United Nations. We all want to encourage you throughout the month of August to consider meeting with your members of Congress. All of your members of Congress will be back home for August recess. Therefore, this is a really exciting opportunity for you to be able to not only talk about your personal story, why you're involved in UNA USA, and how you contribute to your chapter, your respective chapter, but also to talk about the findings from this poll and why this is so significant and why your member of Congress should find this interesting and important to know. So with that, I do want to go just very quickly as a brief overview on how you can meet with your members of Congress. And then after we go into, or after we finish that part of the presentation, we'll transition over into a Q&A with Erica. So as you all know, meeting with your member of Congress is the signature advocacy, priority that we strive to instill in all of our members. And aside from meeting with your members of Congress during our Global Leadership Summit, you all have the opportunity to do so at home. And the way that you do so is by contacting the scheduler in your members of Congress's district office. Your members of Congress will have at least one district office in your community. And so if you are interested in meeting with them to talk about the importance of the United Nations, the importance of American support for the UN, you would contact the scheduler from the district office and ask to schedule an in-district meeting as a constituent. It's also an important reminder that as a constituent and as a voter, as a person that lives in that district, you have the responsibility and the opportunity to meet with your member of Congress, and your member of Congress has the responsibility to answer to you. So this is, like I said, just a really great opportunity given that all members will be back home for the August recess. We also want to help you in any way possible. If you do happen to get a meeting scheduled and in the calendar, please reach out to us. I will send after this webinar my contact information as well as our online inquiry forms so that you can let us know how we can best serve you to help you before your meeting with your member of Congress. Just some really quick tips for success when you do meet with your member of Congress. It's important that if you have that you arrive early, that you introduce yourself, talk about who you are, where you're from, of course, but of course who you're representing, which leads to the next bullet point, and to talk about UNA USA, the impact that you strive to make as a UNA USA member, why you got involved with the organization, and overall make the ask, which for us is to urge members of Congress to fund the United Nations. And you can use some of the polling data that you heard today to back that argument. As Erica so beautifully mentioned throughout her presentation, all of this polling data is bipartisan. And it's important that we remember that. Therefore, if you do happen to get a meeting scheduled with your member of Congress, mentioning your party affiliation will not be necessary. It's also really important to not make up answers on the spot. We all have a lot of various different interests when it comes to the United Nations, but we all don't have the answers. I wish I had every single answer about the UN, but we all have a part to play, and if there is a specific question that you get and you don't have the answer to, we'd be happy to answer those questions on your behalf here from our national office if we can. Also, please do not record audio or video during your meetings. And just lastly, don't forget these important reminders when meeting and talking about the UN with your members of Congress. Remember that you have a personal story. A lot of you are involved in UNA USA for various different reasons. Whether you're a student or a chapter leader in your college or university and are wanting to hopefully maybe eventually work at the UN, maybe you are a former UN staffer yourself. Maybe you're a former refugee or a migrant and you've seen the work of the UN firsthand. All of those story elements are really important for you to mention when meeting with your member of Congress. And of course, to talk about the hard facts and data, such as the polling that Erica was talking about earlier, for you to really wrap everything into one very nice present to bring to the meeting when you get that scheduled. Also, it's important to be concise and to stay on message. Remember that our core ask is to urge Congress to fully fund the UN. That is ultimately our ask. And of course, by fully funding the United Nations, we are achieving various different goals, whether it's achieving our huge fight to combat climate change, whether it's achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 1, zero poverty, whether it's achieving gender equality, LGBTI equality. There are various different aspects of the UN, and all of the different funds and programs help to achieve all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then lastly, be sure to ask for a photo to commemorate your visit. We want to see how your meeting went. Tag UNA USA in those photos on social media, and be sure to use our official hashtag USA for UN. So with that, I want to open up the floor for any questions that you might have for Erica about the poll itself, or for any questions you might have for myself on how you can translate this information and execute it into an in-district meeting with your member of Congress. We do have a chat option on the far right corner, so if you do have any questions, please feel free to include them in the chat. So we have a question from Jack. What is the relationship between UNA USA and the Better World campaign? Erica, do you want to answer that?
Sure. At the Better World, we are what we call ourselves sister organizations. So we work very closely together. At the Better World campaign, we are really focused on the policy side of the House, working directly with members of Congress and their staff. And then UNA USA, thanks to members like you, is really our grassroots arm that can go out and spread the message at a local level with individual members by telling your story, by meeting in district, as Marco mentioned, etc. So we work very closely together, and if you we co-produce a lot of content. So if you've seen, for example, our congressional briefing books are always co-branded. They're always developed in partnership, as well as a lot of other products that we develop.
Couldn't have said it better. I think overall, the way I like to think of it is, UNA USA is the grassroots, working with people and communities hand in hand, and but the Better World campaign is that grass tops organization working with policymakers and members of Congress, and we work together to sort of learn from each other and also communicate any messaging to all of you. We have another question from Alexandra. Will the webinar be recorded? Yes, I will send a link to the recording after this, and as well as the slides for your reference.
And I should also add, we will send you the link to the Better World Campaign website where the poll lives. We have this data and all of the historical data all on one page, so you can click and download every single piece of research we've done. And what we suggest is, for example, we put together both press releases but also executive summaries. We also have a one-pager, so all of the collateral that you might be interested in will be found on that page, and we'll make sure to send that to you because it is all public.
Great. So as Erica mentioned, all of the results, and this is answering your question, at least I hope I answer your question, Phil. All of the results from our recent poll will be shared with you after this message in the executive summary. So hopefully you'll be able to look at that in more detail. And I will also send them with the graphs as well.
And the one pager.
John has a question. How do I get information on the UN's efforts on climate change? I am working to set up a meeting with Congress people next month on climate change and would like to emphasize the work to push for funding. Absolutely, John. We are, as a organization, UNA USA is striving to have a greater climate focus into the fall. As all of you probably know, this year's UN Day will be very climate focused. Our Planet, Our Future is the official theme. And so one just thing on the horizon that I would mention that the UN is going to work on in September through the work of the Secretary General, through the Office of the Secretary General, I should say, is that there will be a youth climate summit in September in which young people from all over the world will be coming to offer their climate solutions. And this will be including the United States. And so this is a really unprecedented opportunity, especially for the next generation of leaders to take action on climate change. And so that is something that I feel like would definitely grab a members' interest. Therefore, I would definitely talk about that opportunity that the UN is working on. And we will also, as an organization, be present in those deliberations and giving readouts for all of our members across the US.
And I'll add that in terms of collateral, we do, in the congressional briefing book that I mentioned, there is a section on climate that you can print out and reference. It gives a little bit of background on what the UN's been doing and puts it in a position in terms that policymakers can understand. So that's a great resource that I would look into.
All right. All right, we do have a question from Bonnie. What are some of the main differences of this poll versus the previous poll? That's a really great question. I'll let Erica answer that.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we conduct a lot of polling. This particular poll was focused on some of our main tracking questions over time, just to get a sense of how the UN is doing this year compared to other years. So in particular, it was really reassuring to see that the UN's favorability is at the highest it's been since we started tracking. That is truly a great figure to see and hear, and that the UN is really performing, is really viewed more favorably than a lot of other American a lot of other institutions, particularly American institutions, that are highly regarded. So particularly seeing how the UN is compared to NATO and Congress, seeing how really that much more favorable is great. I would also say, we don't think about this a lot, but seeing how it's the least opposition to the UN's favorability is important. So we not only want people to have positive views of the UN, but it also means that through our work, we're starting to see a shift, and we're starting to be successful in changing the hearts and minds of people, because if you see, there's less pushback against the UN in some of these answers, which is always great to see. And then the one new question we added this time around is the question on whether the US should leave the negotiating table or kind of stay and fight. And as you saw, the majority of voters really think that we need to stay at the negotiating table. We need to keep finding different solutions to get to achieve our objectives. So it was to see that the majority of Americans don't want to see us quit, particularly as we've seen a lot of disengagement from things like the Paris Agreement, the Human Rights Council, et cetera, that in reality, this is not what the American people is. We're seeing that they actually want us to find different solutions at the UN, not just leave the negotiating table.
Great. Any other questions that we have from the audience? Be happy to take them and to pick Erica's brain while we have her.
Can I ask a question just by voice? I can't tell how to send in one by email since I'm on my phone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you state your name and your chapter, where you're calling from?
Sure. I'm Steve Mosley. I'm the president of the UNA NCA, National Capital Area Chapter. And I guess because I live in Washington, I'm very aware of today's headlines that announce that there's an overall 2-year budget deal likely to be agreed upon so as not to shut down the government, raise the debt limit. Am I correct that still all the individual bills, including the foreign assistance area bill, which includes the support through the State Department to the UN, still needs to be passed in September, so that we go into the new fiscal year with this fiscal year paid for?
Hi, Steve. This is Erica. So yes, you are correct in that the specific bills still need to pass. So that is the kind of the big number. There's a budget deal on the big number, but how that number gets divided is not agreed upon. And if you have specific questions about that, I can certainly get additional information from our advocacy lead, Jordy Hannum, whom you know.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that's just fine. Thanks very much.
But Steve, you bring up a really good point in terms of why sending messages and why meeting with your members of Congress is also really important throughout the month of August, given that that number, that budget hasn't been agreed upon. This will continue to be a battle that we will go through into the fall. Therefore, we do need all of your collective actions continued on the advocacy front to ensure that our message is clear and that we want members of Congress to fully fund the United Nations.
Yes, no, exactly. Thanks very much.
Dave Wiley, Greater Lansing, Michigan chapter. Is the data available online specific to state or other geographical divisions in the U.S., or is it only gross national data?
So we do not have the crosstabs online. Again, this was an 800-person poll nationwide, so we don't have it state-specific. So no, that data, we do, I think it's divided into northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, but they're pretty vague divisions because the sample size is really just a national sample.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, to help answer at least part of your question about maybe looking into what you can say on behalf of your state in terms of how the UN is impactful. I do know that on the Better World Campaign website, there is a map that helps to break down each of the 50 states and the impact that that state has received as a result of the work of the United Nations. So I don't know if Erica, you have anything more to add on behalf of that.
Yeah, the map is a great resource. And if you click on your state, you can hit print and it will print out only the data from the state you've selected. So you can definitely take that to the Hill, and we've seen how effective those one-pagers are. So for example, you would see how many people have sent letters to their members of Congress in that specific state in support of full funding for the UN. You would see how many contracts the UN has with companies in that specific state. So there's actually a number of a revenue number that we've indicated in there. You would see how many people are champions for other UN Foundation-wide campaigns and how they're supporting whether it's vaccines or girls' education or ending malaria, etc. So that is definitely a great resource. And it does include the national survey results at the top, but it does not go into specifics on the actual poll.
Yeah, we've looked at those actually, and the pop-up windows that are specific to a state with that data seem to disappear when you try to copy them. So
don't try to copy them. When you click on your state, hit print, and it should print out in a different format. So it will no longer show the map. It'll just show you the state. And if it's not working properly, please, Marco will share our contact information. You can reach out to me and I'll see what's going on. But it should be able to print out the state, not when you actually hit the print button.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Hi, this is Jack Friedlander from Santa Barbara. When I met with our congressional representative last year, he was fully knowledgeable about the UN and 100% supportive of its mission and fully funding it. He gave good reasons why. If I were to meet him again, for an annual meeting, what additional information should I be conveying to him, or does it even make sense for me to meet with him again, given that he's fully supportive of the UN?
I think it's certainly, despite if you're a member of Congress is fully on board, you met with them 1,001 times, I'm always a huge advocate to continue those efforts because of the fact, as I can't reiterate enough, this is a battle in terms of the funding that is always at risk. But this is an increasing concern in terms of getting fully funded UN dues on behalf of the U.S. And even if your member of Congress is fully supportive, I would say that it is important for you to voice your concern and to talk about, why the president's budget request doesn't reflect what you believe as a constituent, why Congress as a whole should fully fund the United Nations, and also to appreciate that your member of Congress has been funded. It's important, for that message to get relayed as well. Obviously, meeting with your members, you're going to have an agenda, you're going to have a mission to sort of fulfill, but also don't forget that it's, you want to be able to thank your members of Congress, especially if they are supportive of the issue, for them to continue the work that they're doing on the Hill and in the district.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? We have a question from Sarah that I think is very interesting. Did this survey, or will future surveys, ask opinions on particular parts of the UN? For instance, someone could have high satisfaction with the UN Human Rights Council, but not the Security Council.
So we have not asked that, gone into that granularity, particularly on nationwide polls. It gets a little bit tricky because the amount of knowledge that the general public has on the differences and intricacies is fairly low. So trying to get accurate information on their satisfaction or favorability of the Human Rights Council versus Security Council on someone who says they're somewhat familiar with the UN is very tough. So I think it's an interesting consideration for maybe an opinion elite poll or some, an engaged group of Americans. But when you're going out to the general public, it is a little bit harder to go into that granularity. That being said, it's definitely something that I've taken a note of, and I'll see if there are if anyone else is doing research that includes that level of detail, and I can send it around if I do find any.
Hi, this is Sarah. Thank you for that answer. And I guess a corollary to that would be, if you know anyone who is trying to measure UN literacy at like a basic level so that we have a better feel for what parts of the UN folks are familiar with or are less familiar with, because that might be a preemptive study or question before getting into their respective satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that, for example, last year we conducted research among Gen Z and millennials, and we did ask them to rank their knowledge level on, and they are somewhat comfortable, but I could see that they couldn't even get into this level of granularity. So it certainly is a challenge, but I'll take a look and see if I can find anything around that. That's a great question. Thank you, Sarah.
This is Jack. It'd also be interesting to find out when people respond to this survey, have a favorable impression or less than favorable impression of the UN and voting for support. What's behind the opinion? Is it the news that comes out about what the UN is doing? Is it certain UN policies they're supporting or not supporting? It just helps to understand. It's like you get a different type of answer once you drill down. But what is driving their opinion?
Yeah. In fact, past years, a few years ago, I think we did some focus groups around that, and the whole purpose was to really try to understand and drill down, because it is very hard on a poll. You do have to have a conversation and get more information. Unfortunately, those results are really outdated now, but it is certainly something to consider for future research. So thank you.
Yeah, I think the focus groups would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience before we conclude our webinar this afternoon? No, thank you all again for taking the opportunity to tune in on your Tuesday afternoon. As I will send information about the poll after this webinar, including an executive summary and a one-pager. I will also send information on how you can meet with your member of Congress if this is an opportunity that you are interested in participating in this August. But aside from that, thank you all again. Like I said, you should be receiving an email shortly after our webinar today, and I will, in addition to what I just mentioned, also include Erica's contact information should you have more questions. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Aloha. Thank you. See everyone next time.